Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. If you're new, my name is Solomon Thomas. I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I just got my master's in general psychology, and I have the goal of becoming a clinical psychologist one day and a professor. So I'm making these YouTube videos to practice clarifying my thoughts on some of the ideas that I've been thinking about for a while and that I'm coming across in my current studies. And I also hope that some of these ideas can be useful or interesting to anyone out there who's listening. And so this video is going to be part 3 of a series. I don't know how long it's going to be, but I'm calling it Personality Dynamics. And I'm really just trying to get a better understanding of what personality means, what it is, what are the causal factors that play into individual differences in terms of personality, and all of that stuff. So what I'm going to do is recap quickly the first and the second video, and then I'm going to dive into depth psychology for this video, specifically focusing on Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, and Carl Jung, and how their ideas tie to this overall theme that I'm trying to develop, that we see the world through a story. So in the first video, I tried to introduce the frame problem and discuss cybernetic solutions to the frame problem. The frame problem manifested in the 1960s, and it was formalized across many disciplines such as artificial intelligence and cybernetics. And it essentially states that given that there's a near infinite number of facts in the world, how do we determine what's relevant and what's irrelevant? The cyberneticians who were running into this problem would say that the solution to the problem deals with values. And a value is simply a preference. When you want to perform one action over another action, you're valuing the first action over the second action. And it's not only values. The cyberneticians would also say that we filter out what's important to us in the world based on our goals. And those goals are tied to, some of them, intrinsically our existence. So for the human cybernetic system, we have to eat, we have to drink water, we have to regulate our temperature. And so with those goals, we need to perform certain actions, and we also have to see the world in a certain way in order to maintain our survival. Some of those goals are also learned, and so it's not just that we have innate goals such as eating and drinking water, which we do have. We also learn how to socially navigate our environment so that way we can harmoniously accomplish those goals with other people. So it's not just that I go out and steal food because I'm hungry. I have to go out and get a job so I can make money, so that way I can then go to the grocery store and buy food and come home, prepare it, and eat it and satisfy that innate goal. So we have these hierarchical goals that filter out what's important to us in the environment. And so from a cybernetic perspective, that's one solution to the frame problem. And this is something that I got from Dr. Jordan Peterson. Most of what I'm about to talk about came from him or from people that he's read. When you describe this value structure through which we see the world, it's a story. And a story is simply a pattern of organizing information. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. There are characters in the story. There's a set of plots or a plot, which is just, you could also think of it as a sequence of intentions. That's what the plot is. And then there's a setting. There's a time and place within which these goal-oriented actions that move you from the beginning through the middle to the end take place. So in the second video, my goal was really to ground those cybernetic principles into biology, taking primarily from the work of Larry Swanson, Jeffrey Gray, and Neil McNaughton. And my attempt in that video was to say that, well, a cybernetic system solves the frame problem in part by utilizing a frame of reference or a value-laden structure through which we engage with the world and block out all of that which is irrelevant. How can we take some of those principles and ground them into the neuropsychology of, say, the human being? And the cyberneticians would use principles such as reference values, which is a goal. They would use input and output, And they would use a comparing mechanism, all of this which could be thought of as feedback dynamics that enable us to interact with the world, distinguishing what's relevant and what's irrelevant. So I tried to ground the reference value principle in the dynamics of the hypothalamus, and that primarily came from the work of Larry Swanson. I tried to ground the notions of inputs and outputs into the fact that we have sensory organs that enable us to receive information externally from the world and also sense what's going on inside our body. And we have a nervous system that is hierarchically organized within our body, on top of which is the hypothalamus, and that helps us mediate motivated behavior. So that could be outputs. And then the comparing mechanism that enables us to sense our current state, understand what our goal is, what our desired state is, and compare them to see what the distance is. That comparing mechanism I grounded in the septohippocampal system, in the behavioral inhibition system, which is a set of different brain regions that all connect and interact through different means to allow us to behave in the world and to perceive the world. So I would refer those videos for more specifics, but this video is really a third attempt to do what I did in the first and the second video. The first video, I tried to delineate, elucidate cybernetic principles for how we solve the frame problem. The second video, I tried to say the same thing, but from the perspective of neuropsychology. And in this video, I'm going to take the perspective of depth psychology to put forward the notion that we see the world through a story. And perhaps in the next video or in the video after that, I'll then draw implications from this idea that we see the world through a story to personality and personality psychology and individual differences. So, okay, the depth psychologists. As I mentioned, Freud, Adler, Jung. We'll start with Freud. He really started the domain of depth psychology, within which is his specific psychotherapy, which is called psychoanalysis. So Freud was interested in the depths of the mind. He was a physician and he studied hypnotism, and he interacted with patients, understanding that there were memories and thoughts and ideas and feelings that the patient was not aware of. And exactly why it's called depth psychology, other than the metaphor of there are things deep within us that we don't understand, and there are just depths in the mind that we need to explore, I don't exactly know. It could just be just that metaphorical connection. But that's what Freud and the other two thinkers that we'll talk about were trying to do. They were trying to explore the depths of the mind. And many of these ideas were also there, existing in that culture and time, in the scientific milieu, prior to Freud. And so there's a great book by Henri Ellenberger called The Discovery of the Unconscious, where he really dates the depths of the mind, let's say the unconscious, hundreds of years, I would say, prior to Freud. And even a couple of decades prior to Freud, I would say along with him, there were researchers such as Pierre Genet, who already had the idea of the subconscious. And then there was the philosopher Nietzsche, who had ideas about unconscious dynamics such as displacement and the different defense mechanisms that people do but aren't aware of in order to protect their ego, to protect themselves from anxieties and fears and regrets and things they don't like. So there were many ideas that were already at play prior to Freud, but I would say that Freud really formalized the idea that there was an unconscious part of the mind that motivated our perceptions and behaviors in ways that we didn't really understand and that we weren't really aware of as individuals. You could also say that in the culture at that time, there was a more materialistic, rational perspective of humanity, where, although behaviorism came a little bit later, there was this stream of thought that, well, there's the world out there, there's information out there in the world and the environment, and it impresses itself on us, and the information causes us to see the world, to know about it, and to behave. Well, you can think of the depth psychologists as saying, yes, that does happen to a degree, but also there are faculties, this is kind of taking from Immanuel Kant, there are faculties and a priori structures that we bring to the table. And the different depth psychologists differed in how they described those structures and the nature and the characteristics of those unconscious dynamics that we bring to the table when we're experiencing the world. But they all agreed that we weren't only stimulus response creatures. We bring something to the table when we interpret the information that's in front of us, for better or worse. So, for example, Freud believed that it depends on when you read Freud and where along his thinking you're encountering him, because his thinking did evolve over time. But generally speaking, Freud would say that we are motivated by our sexual instinct and by the death instinct. And the sexual instinct could be, at some point, it's merely just lust, depending on when you read Freud again, and at other times it's creative engagement with reality. It's a positive type of enthusiasm to generate ideas and to contend with the world. So that's the sexual instinct, and then the death instinct somehow is related to our aggressive urges, and that was definitely influenced by Adler, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. So for Freud, the unconscious was that part of the mind that housed these primary two instincts, although Freud was open to more instincts, that motivated how you saw the world. And that relates to the idea that we see the world through a story, because when the system is the cybernetic system, the human being, the psyche, when it's motivated to see the world in a certain way, that kind of begs the question, well, are you seeing what's there in reality? Are you seeing the thing in itself? It could be anything. When you are having a conversation with your spouse, or you're talking to a friend, or you see a social interaction at work. As I mentioned in the beginning with the frame problem, there are many different interpretations that you can utilize to derive meaning from, let's say, a conversation with your spouse. But to say that we see the world through a story, and then particularly from the perspective of the depth psychologist, to be motivated means that you're more likely to adopt one frame of reference, one interpretive frame, over all of the others that you could use. And then that's another question. Well, if there are multiple modes of interpreting the world, which one is correct? And that's something that we'll get to later. But for Freud, he believed that the sexual instinct and the aggressive death instincts were motivating forces that bias you to see the world in a certain way. And your goal, more or less, generally speaking, was to satisfy these urges and to attain pleasure, and to avoid non-pleasure. So we'll park Freud aside for a second. The gist I'm trying to convey is that he, like the other depth psychologists, said that we bring something to the table, and we have these deep motivations that bias us to see the world in a certain way, for better or worse. So Adler, like Freud, also believed that we brought something to the table when it comes to experiencing the world. And he would say that the primary motivation was the striving for superiority, which is somewhat tied to aggression. So Adler and Jung had ideas and a reputation prior to collaborating with Freud, I would say in the early 1900s, around 1905, I would say. So all three of these men had their previous ideas, met together, started a club, collaborated and influenced each other, and then went their separate ways. So I might bounce back and forth between the three, but right now with Adler, he did believe that there was an unconscious, and he did accept that. He accepted the idea that we were motivated to see the world in a certain way. And he predicated his idea, his primary motivation of striving for superiority, on the idea that all humans, perhaps all animals, were inherently inferior in one way or another. And given this inferiority, perhaps it's primarily unconsciously known to us, we would strive to compensate in some form or fashion as we're dealing with the social environment, and perhaps also as we're dealing with the physical environment. And those compensations can become pathological, or they can be normative in terms of just regular human behavior that is socially acceptable. And Adler went pretty far in this idea that we see the world through a story. I think he would agree with it most explicitly of the three. Jung is another contender, because Adler had this idea that at the age of around 3 or 4 or 5, you would adopt and embody what's called a prototype. And the prototype was a combination of an ideal goal that you set for your life at a very young age and a strategy or a few strategies for accomplishing that goal. So the prototype was a goal, an ideal goal, and let's say an ideal strategy. And that it was a story. Adler specifically used the term fiction. We would act as if this prototype was how our life was supposed to be and how we should guide ourselves in terms of our patterns of perception and behavior. And so this prototype would be unconscious, likely, or at least part of it would be unconscious, and the child would go through their life striving for this ultimate goal that they have in their mind, for better or worse. They would act as if it's true, for better or worse. So someone who developed a prototype in their young age, say around the age of 5, who asserted that in order to compensate for their inferiority, they needed to dominate everyone else, either in terms of bullying them or playing tricks on them or demeaning them, they might find throughout their adolescent and adult life that they have a lot of trouble making friends. And so this might be the primary reason why they would see someone like Alfred Adler or anyone who trained with this paradigm called individual psychology. That's Alfred Adler's school compared to, say, Freud's psychoanalysis. And Adler would believe that what needed to be done would be to highlight the fact that this individual has a prototype like everyone else, and that this individual has inferiorities just like everyone else. But he would encourage them to take on the task of perhaps changing their goal or changing their strategy to be more socially acceptable, so that way they could have a better life, particularly as it comes to social relations. But the big point that I'm trying to highlight from Adler's perspective is, again, just like Jung, or just like Freud, Adler believed that we were motivated to understand our experiences in a certain way, and these motivations, in Adler's perspective, the primary motivation of striving for superiority, colored how they saw the world and how they behaved in it. And finally, we'll come to our final theorist, who his name is Carl Jung, and his school of thought was called analytical psychology. And again, as a depth psychologist, he believed that we saw the world through a story. He believed that we had a motivated component of our being that guided our perceptions and behaviors in the world. And as with Freud, the primary motivations were sexual instinct and the death instinct. For Adler, it was the striving for superiority to overcome inferiority. For Jung, I'm still working through exactly how to conceptualize it, but it's something like the generation of meaning. So Jung believed that, and there's overlap again with the other theorists, Jung believed that we had these sub-personalities within us. You could call them complexes, you can call them archetypes, and they were parts of our psyche that were in part a instantiation of the collective evolution of humanity. And so this would be like his collective unconscious. And these different parts responded to how we consciously interacted in the world. He believed in part that the unconscious, within which in Jungian thought there's a personal unconscious and then the collective unconscious, within the unconscious there were compensatory dynamics, compensation, a term, an idea that Jung borrowed from Adler, that reacted to behaviors and perceptions in consciousness. And so for every act or thought or behavior, the opposite would manifest itself in the unconscious. And at times, say when we're dreaming or when we're daydreaming or free associating, or perhaps even in different artistic expressions, the unconscious would have these opposing ideas or thoughts manifest themselves into conscious expression. And oftentimes, we consciously would not like those unconscious urges. And what we would do sometimes is suppress them. And so Jung believed that if you suppressed the unconscious urges enough, what would happen is that they would develop into what he called a complex or a feeling-toned idea, I think is what he called them. And these were sets of ideas that surrounded a emotional core. It gets complicated. And if you suppress those unconscious urges enough, the complex would generate enough emotional power to be able to manifest itself in the ego and consciousness and take over. And so this would happen when let's say if you get extremely angry and you do something or you say something that you regret, or even if you have like a lustful complex that takes over and guides you to do certain inappropriate behaviors that you would later regret, we could become possessed, for lack of better terms, by these complexes if we suppress them enough. And so Jung believed that you should listen to those unconscious urges, not necessarily be directed by them, but to personify them and give them a voice and to debate them, somewhat like as if you were a parent raising, say, an adolescent teen, where let's say there are two extreme responses, right? You can be overcome by the complex and identify with it and let it possess you, or you could ignore it and suppress it. And neither of those are good responses. And what you want to do is listen to the complex, understand that it's a part of you, that it's a sub-personality that's within you, but then you want to integrate it. And so you don't want to over-identify with it, you don't want to suppress it, but you want to assimilate it into you. And for Jung, this was through giving it a voice, personifying it, having an internal conversation with it in your mind, and by putting it in its proper place. And so, for example, if you had an aggressive complex where on the outside, when you're wearing your persona and even in your conscious thoughts, you think that you're a nice person and you would never hurt anyone, but you actually have this part of you that could be very aggressive and filled with rage, what you would want to do is not ignore it and not over-identify with it, but understand that it's a part of you and understand that there might be times where it is appropriate to allow that aggressive urge to manifest itself, or to understand that there are times where you can let it manifest itself, but in a certain socially acceptable way, perhaps when you're playing sports or something. So for Jung, we were motivated to identify those opposing instincts and urges within us and to engage in a dialogue with them and to derive a meaningful relationship that develops a hierarchical self, a personality that is more full and more holistic instead of being one-sided, as Joseph Frischlach put it. I'm not sure if Jung would actually use those terms, but Joseph Frischlach is a personality psychologist that I'm reading to supplement some of these ideas. And so you don't want to be too one-sided. You want to understand that there are many different components within you that are striving at times for their own autonomy, but that they need to be integrated and put in their proper place, not ignored, and they shouldn't be allowed to take the highest place in your personality and in your psyche all the time. So all of that to say that I think that it's reasonable to propose that Jung would say that we see the world through a lens of meaning. So video's kind of choppy, I'm gonna edit it and we're gonna see how it works out. But the point of this video that I'm trying to convey is that There's too much information in the world. We have to make a comprehensible sense of the information so that we can act. And from the perspective of the depth psychologists, we are motivated by these instincts or drives or subpersonalities in such a manner that we can ignore many sets of facts in the world that aren't related to those certain instincts. And for Freud, it was the sexual and the death instinct. For Adler, it was the striving for superiority, perhaps related to aggression. And then for Jung, it was an instinct predicated on a unifying meaning of understanding and integrating your own internal psyche, so that way you can be better adapted for the physical and social environment. Okay, I'm gonna end the video there. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.